Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Space Traffic Management Diverse Dozen. This is the second session of the Space Traffic Management track underwritten by Jacobs. This session will feature a series of rapid-fire lightning talks with no additional Q&A, but a fantastic lineup of global space leaders. And now we are pleased to welcome Dawn Hickton, Executive Vice President for Critical Mission Solutions at Jacobs, to introduce the session.
Thanks, Nathan, and welcome everybody. On behalf of Jacobs and the AIAA, we want to thank you for joining the ASCENDx Summit and this session on space traffic management. My name is Dawn Hickton, and I lead Jacobs' Critical Mission Solutions line of business. And we are proud to partner with AIAA to present this important topic and hear from some incredible thought leaders from around the world on the issues surrounding safety, security, and sustainability in the regime of space traffic. As I'm sure all of you on this call are fully aware, the space around Earth is filled with literally millions of pieces of human-generated debris from thousands of rocket launches and spacecraft that have been placed in orbit since mankind first ventured into space in 1957. Human-generated space debris poses the greatest threat to NASA's crewed and uncrewed vehicles in low Earth orbit and presents threats to military communications and tracking systems in orbit. That's an intimidating thought as we see many new commercial and government launch systems moving from deployment into operations, as well as several new commercial constellations containing tens of thousands of satellites being launched. Jacobs scientists and engineers support NASA's Orbital Debris Program Office in measuring and modeling debris and mitigating its effects to ensure the safe navigation and utilization of space. But space is going to get a lot more crowded in the near future, and the implications to space systems designers and operators are significant. Forums such as this ASCENDx Summit are vital to get the right people talking and to help drive challenges, or to help drive action to address these challenges. So our host for this lightning round of talks is Moriba Jah. Moriba is an associate professor of aerospace engineering and engineering mechanics at the University of Texas in Austin, where he is the holder of the Mrs. Pearlie Dashell Henderson Centennial Fellowship in Engineering. And prior to his current position, Moriba worked in the Air Force Research Laboratory and NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where he was a spacecraft navigator on a handful of the Mars missions. He has served on the U.S. delegation to the United Nations Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. He's an elected academician of the International Academy of Astronautics and has testified to Congress on his work as related to space situational awareness and space traffic management. He's an associate editor of the Elsevier Advances in Space Research Journal. He serves on multiple professional society technical committees. And believe me, Moriba is clearly the right person to lead this incredible group of people. And so take it away, Moriba.
Dawn and Jacobs, thank you so much for introducing this really awesome inaugural event at AIAA Ascend, the Space Traffic Management Diverse Dozen. So why the Diverse Dozen? Where does this stuff come from? We tend to hear often that things need to be more inclusive. What is inclusivity? It's when diversity has a voice. And, you know, humanity has all but forgotten what it means to live in harmony, seek balance, be able to have agency, no matter what your walk of life is, in weighing in on very critical issues, not the least of which is the sustainability of our space environment. So what I've been able to do with AIAA is to bring you 12 voices from around the globe that have something to share with you about their ideas and thoughts and feelings about how we can actually achieve space safety, space security, and space sustainability related to space traffic management. Welcome. Booyah!
Michael, go ahead. We can hear you.
Excellent. Michael Byers here. I'm confined to 5 minutes, so I'm going to be blunt. We have a serious crisis in low Earth orbit. In fact, we're into a tragedy of the commons, and we are going to lose low Earth orbit as a place accessible to humankind if we don't turn this situation around within the next 5 years. That's being blunt, but let me explain. We already have SpaceX launching 60 satellites on a weekly basis right now into low Earth orbit as it establishes Starlink, first with 12,000 satellites. It wants to launch another 30,000 after that. You know about OneWeb, you know about Amazon, you probably know that a Chinese state-owned satellite company has just filed an application with the International Telecommunications Union to launch a mega constellation of its own, 12,000 more satellites into low Earth orbit. So this is all happening very quickly. I've already seen a number of people today talk about the limitations of current space traffic management, the imprecision in terms of defining orbits with regards to satellites and debris and coordination and all of that. Adding to the situation, we don't have automatic collision avoidance technology yet in orbit, and we only have some operators engaging in active deorbiting. So there's a buildup, and we are in all likelihood well into the Kessler syndrome by now. In this context, we also have very fragmented regulation. We have fragmented regulation within individual countries. The FCC is licensing spectrum and orbit, but it's a communications commission. It's not specialized in some of the other aspects of low Earth orbit, some of the issues regarding debris. It's a strange body to be placed in this position. The position becomes even more complicated when you look internationally. A lot of countries don't have regulators with the kind of experience that the FCC has. Many of them, in fact, don't have much in the way of experience at all. And we have a very real prospect now of a race to the bottom as different national regulators, different countries seek to compete for satellite companies to come and incorporate in their country to license their satellites. In the maritime domain, where I've done a lot of work, these are called flag of convenience states, and we're on the edge of that kind of situation, a kind of Wild West where essentially satellite companies can choose their venue and go where regulation is lowest. The International Telecommunications Union plays a limited regulatory role with regards to radio spectrum. It does not assign orbital positions in low Earth orbit. So we don't have the international alignment that we need. Added to this, we have a range of non-commercial actors, including militaries. Low Earth orbit is heavily militarized. And we don't know where all those satellites are. And then on top of that militarization, we've had a series of anti-satellite weapons tests over the years, including most recently India, just a little over a year ago. Imagine an anti-satellite weapons test like the one that India conducted in the presence of mega constellations. Just imagine how we could have a catastrophic acceleration of the Kessler syndrome if that test took place in the context of 50,000 or 100,000 communication satellites in LEO. And so we need dramatic measures to deal with this. We cannot proceed, even if we have improved space traffic management. At some point, we're going to reach and exceed the carrying capacities and get into that death spiral of space debris. So we need to limit the number of satellites. There's no way that any company should be allowed to launch 50,000 or even 12,000 satellites. We need high quality satellites that are built to last. We need to have active on-orbit servicing. We need to have full data sharing. We need to have automatic collision avoidance. We need to limit access to orbital shells so that one company can't simply saturate a shell to the exclusion of all others. And to get to this, we need to have international governance. And there are good models. The International Civil Aviation Organization for international airspace and regional fisheries management organizations for high seas fisheries. This is a really tough place we're in, but we can find a way out if we work together and do so very quickly. Thank you.
My name is Alyssa Gessler, and I am a Brumley Fellow at the Strauss Center for International Affairs and Law at the University of Texas at Austin. How might we cultivate a sense of civic duty in a policy sphere that has no boundaries? The term civic duty refers to a responsibility expected of all members of a society. It is based on the principle that citizens have an obligation to serve their society in exchange for certain rights and privileges. Jury duty, taxes, and even volunteer work in one's own community are useful examples. Thus, the notion of civic duty is inherently linked to political boundaries. The entity to which you owe this duty traditionally must have borders. What could this notion contribute to the field of space traffic management? Well, as my colleague Michael just noted, the proliferation of orbital debris is on course to develop into a tragedy of the commons. A notion of civic duty could help guide the way towards a global norm of space custodianship, wherein spacefaring actors observe certain norms of behavior in exchange for the crucial benefits which we all receive from space. Therein lies the challenge. How might we foster a sense of civic duty in a region without boundaries, where every actor, regardless of their national origin, stands to win and lose in equal proportion? Terrestrial political boundaries have historically developed as a response to an economic benefit or a defense rationale. On the Persian Gulf, modern nation states, as we typically conceive of them, didn't develop until the late 20th century following the discovery of oil. Prior to this time, the area was predominantly inhabited by either Bedu, meaning nomadic, or Haddar, meaning settled tribes. In an effort to protect its vital trade routes and stamp out piracy off the Persian Gulf, Britain began entering into agreements with tribal leaders as early as the 1820s. These Gulf sheikdoms, which came to be known as trucial states, deferred to Britain on issues of foreign and defense policy, and in return, they received assurances that Britain would defend the ruling family from any internal or external threats to their power. These sheikdoms would develop into the Gulf states, which we know today. And this particularly and rapidly started to come to fruition after 1971, when Britain withdrew from the region. Thus, we see in this instance how both economic and defense rationales led to the development of borders on the Gulf. I've paraphrased roughly 200 years of history here, so forgive my brevity. What I aim to illustrate is how history impacts the modern policy and ethos of states. Many states maintained some variety of a social contract, which is an idea that originated in the Age of Enlightenment and means that states and citizens are both entitled to certain rights and duties, the origin of a notion of civic duty. The Gulf monarchies, given their wealth and relative short term of existence, tend to have a different type of social contract, wherein citizens receive generous benefits and social services in exchange for political acquiescence. Even the Arabic term for citizen has much different connotation than its English counterpart. The term itself, muwatin, translates something closer to national or one of the nation, given that its root term, watana, means simply nation. Thus, the concept of civic duty in the Gulf varies greatly from a US concept of civic duty, given that the relationship between the citizen in the state is so markedly different. My aim is to illustrate that in space policy, as in all fields of international policy, we are not all operating under the same political models and assumptions. This is further complicated by the presence of non-state actors in space, given that a notion of civic duty, in their case, would be irrelevant. My recommendations are twofold. First, the field of space policy as a whole must recognize the value and necessity of integrating regional studies into our analyses. Not all of us are operating under the same political models, let alone working in the same language. A historical and linguistic perspective is mandatory to understand the cultural nuances which will inherently be reflected in a nation's policies. Second, spacefaring nations who are ahead in the game, such as the US, ought to take on a leadership role in crafting and exhibiting a norm of civic duty in space. It is a great privilege and honor to have the national means requisite to maintain a space program. We ought to honor and acknowledge that privilege by helping to ensure that space remains a prosperous global commons for all. Thank you.
My name is Meshach. I'm from the African Union Commission, which is an intergovernmental body responsible for all the 55 countries of Africa. And I'm going to voice the voice and concern of Africa in the space traffic management. Now, everyone is worried about reaching the Donald Kessler threshold of space debris, and the worries are in two dimensions. The spacefaring nations are wondering, how do we continue expanding our space exploration? But the emerging nations, on the other hand, are asking themselves, is there going to be space left for us anyway? This is a genuine concern because orbits are stretching beyond their carrying capacities. And then there is the imminent threat of the outer space treaty, which is losing its grip. Now, for Africa, access to space is now a necessity than before, due to the growing demand for satellite services as population surges and increase in the industrial development. Africa has launched only about 41 satellites, which are too few for a continent of population of about 1.3 billion people. 11 of these are in GEO, and the rest are in LEO because LEO is relatively affordable. A threat in LEO is therefore a threat to the African capability in space. And this is a real risk now, given that the rise of mega constellation is in hand. LEO is an important orbit for Africa because of its affordability. And the lifetime of geosatellites is predicted by fuel, and therefore the defunct spacecraft are easily moved to a graveyard orbit. But in LEO, the lifetime of many spacecrafts is determined by the failure of components, and that is unpredictable, minimizing the deorbiting possibilities. The Secure World Foundation found that about 40% of active LEO satellites had not maneuvered in 2 years, and that was in 2018, suggesting that they cannot be deorbited easily. Given these situations, more than half of all the trackable debris in space coexist with satellites in LEO. The question is, who will clean up the debris in LEO to make room for Africa and other developing nations? There is no universal agreement as we speak concerning the use of, concerning the cleanup of space debris owing to the technology protection. And again, Africa has invested in astronomy through the Square Kilometer Array. And astronomers are already raising their concerns about the risk of space observations due to the mega constellations. Now, the Outer Space Treaty, the only anchor document of fairness, is at risk of being violated. We are seeing the LEO resources are facing the risk of appropriation, and territorialization could also be imminent on the moon. It begs the question, therefore, is it high time for the revision of the treaty, or at least its enforcement? Either way, it is time for the spacefaring nations to act responsibly and for the UNOSA to start enforcing accountability on the treaty. Now, meanwhile, because Africa has to develop its capabilities and the other developing nations also, here are my recommendations on the role that they can play in the space traffic management. Number one is to use their numbers. There are only a handful of spacefaring nations globally. The rest are either in the stage of developing their technologies or at nascent state. Now, these nations should use their strength of numbers to influence responsible use of space. Number two is Africa as a neutralizer. It has been argued that Africa is the new El Dorado for space due to the rising data consumption and investment in the space industry, generating about $7 billion annually. And Africa also being strategically located near the equator, which makes it an attractive partner for spacefaring nations. Now, Africa should leverage on this opportunity to neutralize the imminent space race and enforce responsible use of space. Number three is one voice of influence. At African Union level, we have established the African Space Agency to coordinate the continental space activities. And in Africa, Africa geopolitics, Africa is neutral and open to indiscriminate partnerships. And this makes Africa welcoming to all the partners that coexist in the globe. So therefore, Africa should use this seat of influence to voice its concern on space sustainability. And I would like also to throw a challenge to Africa and the developing nations. Now, unlike other industries where the second or last mover advantage works, it is not always so in space because the resources are limited and they are contested. Now, climate change has also taught us that the failure to participate does not spare you from any universal consequences. And I think that the cislunar economy is another open check that these nations should actively participate in. And always remember that no one is too poor to participate in space activities because we are all users and payers of its derived services after all, whether we like it or not. I thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Samantha LeMay. I'm a PhD candidate from RMIT Space Research Centre in Melbourne, Australia. I would like to start today by first acknowledging the peoples of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the land where I work and live here in Australia. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Australia. The practical applications of space science and technology in sustainable development are countless. Space capabilities are key to our understanding of climate. Communication, navigation, and observation from space enables recovery from a natural disaster. A global food crisis could be avoided with the aid of space-based technologies that offer solutions for agriculture. Soon, satellite technology could enable every person in the world to connect online, enhancing education, lifting economies, and reducing inequalities worldwide. Sustainable development is defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Progress toward this vision, as it applies here on the ground, has been closely measured and monitored at an international level through the Sustainable Development Goals set out by the United Nations. It is crucial that the same vision for sustainable development is adopted for outer space. Yet, no cohesive international framework exists to measure and monitor our progress towards the sustainable development of the space environment. And meanwhile, volumes of man-made waste in space continues to grow. Sustainability indicators are used widely by the UN and others as an approach to measure and monitor progress towards sustainable development. Historically, the idea of sustainability indicators originated from environmentalists with the emergence of biological indicators to quantify ecosystem health as early as the 1970s. When we think about the motivation of environmentalists to protect the health of ecosystems, perhaps it is challenging to extend this concept to space, because of course there's no biological life in space. However, when we consider that more than 17,000 objects tracked in Earth's orbit are essentially pollution that threatens the livelihood of our space-based resources, which includes the satellites we rely on to measure and monitor pollutions in our oceans, it becomes a much easier task to connect the dots. Developing an international sustainability indicator framework will be necessary to evolve a space environment that promotes economic and social advancement while avoiding environmental degradation, over-exploitation, and pollution. A sustainability indicator framework is a comprehensive and highly scalable information-driven architecture which is relevant to policy. And policy relevance really is key, as the main benefit of using sustainability indicators is to improve the basis for political decision-making. This is an area where adapting existing environmental frameworks for space would make the most significant impact. Policy, regulation, and guidelines, they already exist to prevent the proliferation of space junk, but it is difficult to identify whether such policies and guidelines are being complied with by space participants. It is even more challenging to assess whether current regulations and policy approaches to preserve the space environment are effective. As a starting point, a sustainable development indicator framework recontextualized for the space sector would require the following. 1, international collaboration and participation by stakeholders to inform the development of suitable indicators. 2, indicators that capture the essential characteristics of the space environment. 3, indicators that are quantifiable and scientifically verifiable. 4, indicators that are relevant to space policy so that they can be used as a basis for decision making. 5, the establishment of reference values such as targets, baselines, threshold values, or benchmarks. That's what we would use to measure and monitor our progress against. And lastly, we need a methodology for measuring indicators that is replicable and practical in terms of data collection and cost so that it can actually be implemented globally. Robust science-based indicators for evaluating the sustainable development of the space environment are necessary to ensure society can benefit from space as a resource for generations to come. As the space sector grows and changes, so too will the ways in which we measure and monitor progress in space sustainability. But given the role of space-based technologies in expanding the richness of human life, sustainability needs to be a priority, and we have to start today. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Michael Linden Bernle, Chief Advisor at the National Space Institute in Denmark. I'm going to talk about safe access to space through autonomous infrastructure. We are all painfully aware of the fact that space around Earth is getting crowded, very crowded. Satellites are being launched into orbit around our planet in rapidly growing numbers. This not only increases the number of functioning satellites, but it also contributes to the creation of growing amounts of space debris. Satellite operators will be increasingly challenged when trying to manage their space systems in a safe manner. As the number of human-made space objects skyrocket, the time for the operators to react gets shorter and the margins narrower. The consequence is definitely not a comforting one, an ever-increasing risk of collisions, either between functioning satellites or between a functioning and a dead satellite or some other form of space debris. Is this risk acceptable? The short answer is clearly no. Maintaining safe access to space and the uninterrupted use of space-based systems is absolutely necessary to maintain and expand functions and services essential for our societies. So it is evident that the increasing risk to our space infrastructure has to be effectively mitigated. The obvious question is, how do we do that? Can legislation do the job? Would it be possible to introduce international rules regulating when and in which numbers we launch satellites into Earth orbit? I believe not. Both political and economical interests will prevent this. So what is the alternative? Well, let me introduce you to a concept which could manifest itself as an important tool for securing safe access to space: autonomous infrastructure. The essence of this concept is an infrastructure of autonomous systems that is collaborative and self-organizing. The concept is currently under development for unmanned autonomous systems in classical domains: air, land, and sea. But the introduction of the concept to space, to me, seems natural. Before I present my vision for an autonomous infrastructure for space, let me spend a few words on the key properties of this concept, keeping in mind that the development currently is aimed towards autonomous systems which drive, sail, and fly here on Earth. As mentioned, we are talking about a collective of individual autonomous systems, either independent or in swarms. The focus here is not on the individual systems, but rather on how they interact. The main property is that the infrastructure is autonomously able to both coordinate and deconflict activities in order to operate in the most efficient, safe, and secure way. Within the infrastructure, sensor data are shared between individual systems, as are capabilities for solving tasks. The infrastructure is open for individual systems to join or leave, given the situation at hand. This makes the autonomous infrastructure inherently modular and scalable, controlled mainly by its internal self-organizing structure. Similarly, tasks are handled by an internal coordination and deconfliction within the infrastructure. For a given task, the infrastructure identifies and activates the relevant systems to perform the job, whereas the remaining parts of the infrastructure are ensured not to interfere. The infrastructure can either be tasked directly or identify tasks by itself. The final key property is that the infrastructure, as a result of its collaborative nature, is able to detect and identify anomalous behavior. Systems behaving in a non-collaborative and thus suspicious way will stand out and can be isolated or even neutralized. Now, with these key properties for a terrestrial autonomous infrastructure in mind, how does this translate to space? My reason is that most, if not all, active functioning satellites are part of an autonomous infrastructure that shares data to maintain space domain awareness. Given this awareness, the infrastructure is able to continuously coordinate and deconflict with the fast reaction time, thus effectively limiting the risk of collisions. To put it boldly, our space infrastructure manages itself and does it significantly better than can ever be expected from operators on the ground. Now, the big question is, can this vision be realized? I strongly believe so, at least to a certain level, and the real alternative. Will it be difficult? Absolutely. we are talking about a need for global acceptance and appreciation of the concept of autonomous infrastructure in space, with many conflicting interests involved. Will it be worth the effort? And no doubt, for the sake for safe access to space for us and future generations. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Anastasia Medvedeva. I'm from Space Pals and Powering Space, and here is my greatest fear about space traffic management. Space is becoming cheaper, faster, and simpler. Isn't that perfect? It has never been easier to send something to space commercially, and with all the gray zones provided by space law, almost anything can be sent legally up to space, unless proven to be a weapon, which is yet to be defined. And how should we feel about that? Well, imagine if a company were to send a constellation of small satellites into low orbit to create huge illuminated orbital ads. Coca-Cola once signed a contract with a company providing such technology, but thanks God they were stopped by public opinion. This was only the first attempt, however, and it will not be the last, I feel. The business model today is pretty clear. If you can think of it and you can pay for it, you can launch it. For example, people want to send human ashes to space to make a couple of rounds of spins around our planet and then burn in the atmosphere. It sounds like a great send-off for 1 or 2 people, but what happens if we have hundreds? How do we calculate how many CubeSats can be sent to orbit with ashes or other memorabilia of our loved ones? How should we feel about that? Who is to blame also for what is being sent and what is junk in our orbit? This could be easily worse than the Kessler effect. It can become a complete orbital mess, posing actual threat to the future of human presence in orbit. China, Russia, and the United States are, of course, the main polluters now. However, almost any country can have its own startup providing different kinds of launch and service packages, promising to send anything you want into orbit. And while it makes sense that the 3 biggest polluters should be accountable for the already existing space debris, what would be and what would happen with future commercial junk? What happens while the best legal minds around the world ponder on how to regulate end-of-life rules for space objects? And if legislation takes another 15 years, it might just be too late, just like climate change and the Arctic meltdown. Now, let's think ahead, because there are already people who are creating businesses and services with sending things to the moon, Mars, and other celestial bodies. The moon and Mars are already sort of museums of human-made technology with all the landers and rovers that have been sent there over the years. There is no talk about how to clean that up or how to regulate the amount of junk that can stay there or that can be sent there. So are scientific missions then pollution? And let's not forget about asteroid mining, because there is a lot of talk about technology and how to mine asteroids, but none at how to maintain an asteroid's integrity after drilling. The way out of this is threefold. First, as always, is public awareness, because Earth's orbital environment should be respected as any land on our Earth. Our planet is facing a waste disposal catastrophe caused by reckless behavior and business operations. For example, the plastic island in the Pacific Ocean, animal deaths due to plastic intoxication, the Amazon jungle disappearing. This has all been neglected for far too long and serves as an example of what may become of our planet's orbital environment in no time. We need something like Greenpeace, but just for our orbits. Secondly, we should think about business ethics, because companies who wish to clutter the orbital environment or other celestial bodies should be carefully reviewed and their payloads approved by a governmental or an intergovernmental panel of decision makers. Businesses should be very wary of the orbital environment and understand their responsibility before sending questionable payloads into orbit. And third, which is, I think, the most important, of course, is that we need governmental control, so that each state agency would have an ethics jury containing officials and members of the general public who could evaluate and rate the necessity of certain and questionable businesses. Companies with no clear guidelines or causes for launch should be banned or denied. All cases should be evaluated from 3 main standpoints: scientific value, necessity of launch, and environmental damages to the orbital environment. If we follow through these 3 very basic steps, we would be able to control overall pollution, atmospheric, orbital, and on other celestial bodies. And that would make sure that our orbital future is there. Thank you so much, everyone.
And up next, we have Susmita Mohanty.
Hi, I'm Susmita Mohanty. I'm a serial space entrepreneur, and I'll be talking about how outer space, humanity's shared resource, is fast becoming the next Wild West. In the 21st century, unlike the previous one, the race will not be between nations, but it will be between private companies who are very keen on monetizing space assets, mining space resources, and even ferrying tourists. Let's take stock of some of the happenings in recent years that are symptomatic of the maladies that need to be addressed through legislation and governance. In 2015, during the Obama administration, the US Congress passed a legislation that unilaterally gives American companies the right to own and sell resources that they mine on other celestial bodies. 2 years after that, the Luxembourg Parliament passed the asteroid mining law, which gives mining companies the right to keep their loot. In 2018, Elon Musk he tossed up his red roadster into outer space, which some people think was a nerd baiting technique to create press buzz. And there were others who thought it was an obscene act of megalomania. In 2019, the Indian Prime Minister authorized the first ever anti-satellite technology demonstration test for India, which not only created debris concerns in low Earth orbit where the International Space Station flies, but it also meant that here was another country that joined the ASAT club, previous members being Russia, the United States, and China, and others are bound to follow. The same year, Musk reiterated his idea of nuking the Martian poles to warm up the planet to make it habitable for future human colonists. While it is just an idea that he's proposed, this vocabulary of conquest, of control, of domination, conveniently ignores the human and environmental costs that we have paid and humanity has paid for the colonial adventures here on Earth. Sustainability has become a mere buzzword, which doesn't quite make it to the mental radar of those who are very clearly out to monetize the hell out of everything. In 2019, Virgin Galactic went public on the New York Stock Exchange. And it's not just Branson who wants to ferry casual space tourists to low Earth orbit. There's Bezos, there is Musk, and there might be others in the future. The same year, the satellite constellation company based out of San Francisco, Planet, said that they have crossed the 400 satellite mark. Earlier this year, I don't know what the latest tally is, but I remember in February, Starlink, SpaceX had launched about 715 of their planned 42,000 satellites for the Starlink constellation. So if all of these mega constellations were to launch their satellites, within a couple of years, we will probably exceed the number of satellites that have been launched by humanity since Sputnik was launched in 1957. To me, the concern here is not just of debris, not just of the fact that we will be impacting ground-based astronomy. We are seeing all the hallmarks of what I consider a land grab in low Earth orbit by a handful of private companies. So the behavior by individuals, by companies, by governments is all pointing to the fact that these are the sort of the classic renditions of the Wild West philosophy. He who dares wins, and he who has the money can get away with practically anything. The altruistic principles that were enshrined in the 1967 Outer Space Treaty or the 1979 Moon Agreement have been rendered obsolete for all practical purposes. So I think going forward in this 21st century, if we are to ensure the safety security and sustainability of space operations, given the growing number of space actors, space objects, space debris, adverse space phenomena. Not only do we need far-sighted and enforceable laws, not only do we need reliable real-time space traffic data, I think more importantly, as some of my colleagues here have pointed out, we need planetary ethics. And I think we also need to learn from the traditional wisdom that our indigenous communities around the world have used for thousands of years. And that should be our path forward. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Akib Moin, and I'm from the Space Center at the UAE University. And I'm going to talk about finding windows in the sky, looking at the universe through growing multitude of anthropogenic space objects. The humankind has been looking up to the sky since the time immemorial to find the meaning of existence, establish some sort of connection, and understand the purpose. Humans across all cultures, civilizations have been doing it, giving different names to the practices, but the underlying motivation, which is often misunderstood, has always been to embark on a journey to search for answers. In most cases, some of the probable and plausible answers led to questions, so the quest goes on. In recent times, the search methods and tools are much more efficient and effective, despite the fact there still are more questions than answers. The study of the universe now involves observations and measurements of objects and events using sophisticated instruments all around the globe and in the Earth space. Due to the limitations of human reach, these instruments and facilities serve as our eyes on the universe, and it's imperative that these eyes have a clear vision. Over the years, scientists and technologists have come a long way to enhance this vision to be able to observe and monitor fainter objects and distant events. The ever-increasing capabilities of these telescopes sensors have enabled a number of mind-boggling discoveries, such as the direct detection, direct imaging of a black hole, direct detection of gravitational waves, and so forth. These discoveries are not only leading humankind to a better understanding, but they're also helping find solutions for human life and teaching us to treat our own planet better. There is still a lot of margin to progress, but the enhancement of instrumental capability is not the only challenge the universe explorers have to deal with. There's another major obstruction distorting and polluting our vision of the universe. This obstruction is the deployment of a rapidly and exponentially increasing number of anthropogenic objects in near Earth space. The frequency and the number of spacecraft that have been launched over the past few years are limiting the capabilities of the telescopes to observe particularly faint and distant astronomical objects with accuracy. And this problem is going to become severe as various space companies are planning to launch tens of thousands of commercial satellites. The satellites show up in the data as bright objects, and they're hampering effective studies of the things that astronomers want to look at. So what would be a long-term solution? Would it be effective to resist and protest the exponential increase in the number of man-made objects which have commercial stakes attached to them? Or could there be a clever, scientifically and technologically sound solution? This leads us to a discussion on the framework, which would allow extensive and continuous monitoring and tracking of these objects so as to find cleaner windows where their presence would have the minimum possible effect on astronomical observations. The predictions of the trajectories of space traffic management mechanism through a global space situational awareness infrastructure would make it possible to work out time slots, durations, and regions for unpolluted astronomical observations. Putting together a global space traffic management and space situational awareness network will be a gargantuan task, as it would require the acceptance and involvement of a number of stakeholders who could at least find common ground, understand and accept the problem, and come to a reasonable level of agreement. Naturally, the first step is that the stakeholders start to listen to each other, get into productive and science-based discussions on relevant forums and platforms. Once this critical step has been taken, it would then be a matter of data-driven decision-making, networking, collaboration, and the pursuit of a common goal of advancing further as an intelligent species, thereby gaining better understanding of the existence and connection with the universe as explorers and knowledge seekers. Thank you very much.
Good evening from Berlin. My name is Regina Peltras from DLR, and I'll talk about complex systems. So many in our community appreciate that operating a satellite can seem like wrestling with an exquisite, intangible black box. Our spacecraft is remote and hurtles through one of the most physically demanding, dynamic, and counterintuitive environments that we know. As mission time elapses, the subsystems acquire behavioral quirks that one day may result in a minor anomaly. And on the ground, operations are embedded in the socio-technical jungle made up of mission control software, ground station antennas, cables, server racks, diagnostic algorithms, and the entities that staff, devise, and deploy all these components with their regulatory provisions, export control requirements, shift plans, and configuration documents. All of this makes what we'd call a highly complex system. Complex systems, for instance, nuclear power plants or air traffic control, share a number of common traits. They're somewhat incomprehensible, and we can only ever grasp a tiny sliver of their state and composition in detail, or get an overall representation so abstract that we're liable to oversimplify. They're made up of interdependent elements with very tightly coupled processes, and they behave in nonlinear ways. And complex systems fail. Failure and system accidents are an inherent possibility of high-risk domains, inevitable and normal even. Theories on normal accidents and high reliability teach us that catastrophic failures occur when we're unable to cope with complexity, when our organizations struggle with joint decision-making and communication, when pre-planned procedures are eclipsed by novel constraints of an unexpected situation and we don't adapt, or when we overestimate the shelf life of approaches to handle what we designed as an ideal system, which now is exposed to the realities of operations. And this will be the challenge for one single satellite or a small fleet. Now extrapolate to the hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s of assets proposed to populate orbit within the next decades. Add their different ground infrastructure across geographies, jurisdictions, professional cultures, combining brand new and legacy systems with countless layers of relationships. So essentially, we're in the process of constructing an unprecedented black box of black boxes, by default with the inbuilt potential for failure. Of course, we don't automatically end up with degradation and breakdown. To the contrary, the absence of the most consequential system failure or normal accident is achieved through a continuous preoccupation with their emergence. This is why operators learn from close calls in the past, triple check their decisions in the present, and anticipate future contingencies. And as a result, most of the time, complex systems, such as space operations, do not go wrong, but go right. Also, most high-risk domains learn from disturbance and catastrophic disruption. After the most horrific accidents, new rules are forged and new safety mechanisms implemented. The orbital environment may not yet have experienced the kind of systemic accident that destroyed significant assets and rendered an entire environment inoperable. We did, however, have incidents, both inadvertent and deliberate, that incapacitated satellites and left lasting marks in the form of debris in certain orbital regimes. In turn, these incidents then ushered in fresh awareness of the risks or triggered increased transparency. And we do already have the tools at our fingertips to tackle complexity in space, from multilateral fora to negotiate our goals, to information sharing schemes, capabilities to avoid collisions, and a community of experts that have been highlighting for decades the pitfalls and countermeasures associated with an increased utilization of space. And yet, one attitude is not always quite explicit in our collective thinking these days, but it's indispensable when staring down complexity. Instead of being affirmative and assuming that we will be able to fully absorb the extent to which the space domain is evolving, we'd actually do well to pause and ask ourselves whether we are perhaps succumbing to a sense of hubris. Are we really able to understand, let alone control, this black box of black boxes that is tomorrow's space situation? We may argue not yet. Instead, we should for now cultivate what the most diligent operators bring to their control rooms every day, even just for one single satellite. Humility before an incessantly advancing entropy, because we cannot afford a normal accident in orbit. Thank you.
We all have different masks that we wear, different faces depending on how we expect others to perceive us. We like to know the different faces that people have. Knowing so fosters a sense of trust. Consider how you feel when you can't fully ascertain the full spectrum of an individual's persona. You feel uncertain, uneasy, almost distrustful. The mystery entices and quickly disenchants. Well, what if I told you that there is an entity whose face you've seen almost every night, yet you don't quite fully know? I'm talking about that curious white orb that hangs ominously in the midnight sky. Our planet's closest heavenly neighbor, the face of folklore, mythology, religion, and human periodolic imaginations alike. I'm talking about the moon. Yet from our vantage point, we can only ever observe one of the moon's faces. How then are we so confident venturing to this new mystery that we are yet to fully comprehend? I've entitled this elusive mystery Coordinating the Edge of Beyond, because the moon provides us our most critical gateway to the future of extraplanetary exploration for humanity. See, humanity has renewed its interest in traveling to our celestial companion. This will represent not only a proliferation of interest, but a proliferation of actors, diversity of those actors, and diversity of the activities that they will pursue. Add to this the hazards of the occasional comet or asteroid that will plunge into our night star's vicinity, and we have the makings of a space traffic management conundrum. Consider already the tentative cislunar steps taken by my very continent, where a South African-based company, New Space, launched its components on board the Israeli lunar lander Bereshit. Aptly named after the Hebrew word for Genesis, Bereshit was the first private expedition to the moon's surface. Indeed, however, and unfortunately, due to an engine failure and a subsequent loss of contact, it's highly likely that the lander slammed into the lunar surface, raising new questions on cislunar orbital management. You see, the challenge then with space traffic management is, the further we delve into the deep back and beyond, the harder it will be to coordinate and ascertain the activities and relevant inactivities in outer space. Thus, we need more eyes in the skies, that is, more information on cislunar activities, as the existing methodologies such as radar, radio frequency, and passive means have proven an inadequate last resort. Yes, indeed, NASA has the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which has set an interesting precedent on how we monitor the different faces of the moon. But we require more interoperability in order to foster that real sense of trust and cooperation and coordination in outer space. This is where the concept of cislunar registries comes in, and cislunar situational awareness and registries. Cislunar situational awareness will involve both on-orbit as well as surface surveillance of lunar activities, and a public registry will support the former through providing a transparent window into the many faces of a nation or entity's space ambitions. You see, the current legacy space domain awareness framework is inefficient. In fact, if we're to head back to the moon, we require a completely new architecture. One which firstly recognizes existing technological and economic constraints, and secondly, shortens the lengthy chain of custody for registration, and finally, acknowledges the need for a single canonical registry supported by both private and public actors towards the successful implementation of a space traffic management system. Urging all governments with advanced military databases to contribute their knowledge, this kind of global open data architecture will require each party to provide conjunction assessment information of up to at least 72 hours notice, regardless of whether they are directly affected or not. As well, registration standards are expected to be more onerous and less ambiguous. And finally, mechanisms for decluttering the cislunar orbit will become mandatory prior to launch. In fact, any spacefaring state will have to draft a mandatory cislunar technological and policy roadmap in order to entrench these fundamental recommendations to the force of law and public accountability. This, in my eyes, would represent a successful space traffic management system. Therefore, in conclusion, cislunar situational awareness is a recognition that we need one another more than anything. Having this dual-pronged approach of having space-based observation coupled with an effective registration system is one that will foster collaboration as opposed to competition. In fact, at the end of the day, this will help us to promote the fundamental international space law principles of transparency, interoperability, and most importantly, protecting outer space resources, with the cislunar orbital domain for this present moment as the greatest resource of all. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. I'm Rohel Marie Sese, Chair of the Department of Aerospace Engineering of Ateneo de Davao University in the Philippines, and I'm going to talk about the democratization of space. In the past 60 years since mankind ventured into space, the number of countries that have embarked on space development programs have increased dramatically. From a handful of nations in the 1960s, space is slowly being democratized to the point that even the developing countries are embarking on national space programs. Emerging space nations understand that in current times, space is no longer a luxury, but already a necessity, and is a vital instrument in addressing socioeconomic issues and national development concerns. To date, more and more countries are establishing their own space programs and national space agencies to maximize the benefits that space can provide them. However, this democratization of space has a hidden negative consequence. With the discussions on space policies and treaties being dominated by established space nations, emerging space nations often find themselves simply following the rules set forth. Oftentimes, these rules are tailored to the interests and capabilities of established space nations, and emerging space nations encounter a steep barrier to entry in participating in international discourse. As such, the needs of emerging space nations are significantly ignored and disregarded in the international arena, despite platforms such as the UN Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. The divide and disparity are very much evident on space sustainability issues, such as debris mitigation and space traffic management. While we all understand the need for sustainability to guarantee our ability to access space, oftentimes the rules set forth are difficult for emerging space nations with limited technical capability and budget for satellite development. As one of the youngest national space agencies in the world, the Philippines has tried to deal with these issues even in the early stages of its space program. The Philippines understood the necessity of participating not just on technology transfer partnership programs, but also on discussions on space security, debris mitigation, and space traffic management. Active participation in international fora on these issues is crucial in ensuring that the needs and interests of emerging space nations are heard and taken into account. Hopefully, more emerging space nations will become vocal and active participants in discussions on space debris mitigation and space traffic management, crucial issues that affects them whether they realize it or not. At the end of the day, any set of rules, guidelines, regulations, or treaties imposed to ensure space sustainability affect not just established space nations, but also emerging space nations whose programs are just starting to lift off. Imposing very strict guidelines will further widen the divide between established and emerging space nations. Furthermore, it runs the risk that some countries completely ignoring these guidelines because their needs and capabilities were never considered. Even if these nations are few, their irresponsible actions in space will hinder the progress on everything we have worked on in ensuring space sustainability. The issue of space security, sustainability, and space traffic management affect not just established actors, but also emerging space nations. Established space nations should serve as role models on the proper norms and behaviors in space, and in providing assistance and technology transfer, should not impose steep requirements and regulations that can stifle development, innovation, and opportunities that may benefit the international space community. On the other hand, emerging space nations should be cognizant of their responsibilities in minimizing congestion of the space environment, voicing out their concerns to the space community, and demonstrate its commitment to being a responsible space actor. It is high time that established and emerging space nations work together in this technically and legally challenging endeavor. Space is said to be the common heritage of mankind. This needs to be demonstrated as a reality and not simply pay a lip service. The burden, the challenge, and the responsibility of ensuring space's sustainability for decades to come rests equally on the shoulders of both established and emerging space nations. Only the keen awareness of this fact can ensure that space will be our legacy to future generations, are key to the protection and sustainability of the space environment and are guaranteed to the survival of humanity. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. This is Fermin Romero from Mexico, and my talk is entitled Towards a Global Space Management Traffic System. The vast majority of human beings on the planet are dealing with the current pandemic, climate change, sustainable development, among other solutions, political, social, economic, ideological, and religious challenges. Politicians and businessmen and global entities such as the UN Security Council, NATO, G20, OECD, IMF, World Bank, World Economic Forum, and private groups like the Bilderberg or Global Forum are working together on the agendas of political and economic interests, and decisions are configured in the purest style of global governance in an increasingly complex context. While that happens on the planet, what happens in the outer space beyond the Earth's atmosphere? Well, the space debris is an undeniable reality and a serious threat that should concern all the inhabitants of the planet. However, it must mainly addressed by the minority of that represents the political, military, and economic interests of the governments and companies that have generated. The scientific community has given us a warning about the amount of space debris out there and has demanded greater regulation and the peaceful use of the space. The challenge is to control, reduce, and evacuate the debris, avoid the high cost of the monitoring. The current soft law initiatives we do not have enough force. So a legally binding instrument and a space traffic management authority that regulates this activity is urgently needed. But how did this debris accumulate? The answer is found in the internationalization of the geopolitics of space-faring nations, such as the United States, Russia, and China, in the interest of companies as SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Orbit, Airbus, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Thales, and Planet, to name just a few. And the emerging space power interests of India, France, Japan, United Arab Emirates, and Luxembourg, among others. But how do we solve the debris problem? In near Earth space, multiple and creative technical solutions have been proposed to alleviate the space debris problem. But an effective solution that prevents the aggravation of the problem lies in the updating of the space law at a multilateral level. In addition, we also need to establish a global authority that monitors transparent compliance with the legislation and regulates the effective evacuation waste placed in the LEO and GEO orbit regions. This global authority establishes strict and effective. Sorry?
We can hear you.
Sorry. Sorry, Nathan.
Yes, we can hear you, Fermin.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay,
go ahead.
okay. I'm sorry. I just read an instruction.
Yeah, it's all
okay,
good.
Sorry. How do we solve this problem in the near space? I was talking about that. An effective solution that prevents this aggravation lies in updating the space law at a multilateral level. In addition, we also need to establish a global authority that monitors transparent compliance with the legislation and regulate the effective evacuation of waste placed in the LEO and GEO orbit regions. This global authority will establish strict and effective regulation for future launches, orbital assignment, and final destination of all objects placed into space. To start the global negotiation of a legally binding international convention on the protection of life on Earth, should endorse the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Spaces, copious hypotheses and principles. The resolution of the UN General Assembly on Outer Space that currently shape the international space law, as well as the Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines of COPIUS, IADC Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines, and other supporting documents or protocols from the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs and the International Telecommunication Union. Negotiations for this international convention should also consider recognized of law initiatives on STM standards, national and international, the best practices and insights on the space surveillance and tracking networks, and the International Code of Conduct roadmap. This new international convention must also lay out a global organization for the prevention of risks derived from human activity in the space, a specialized authority to verify that governments and companies fully comply with the updated precepts of space law. In addition, this organization needs to acknowledge all the agencies and networks for monitoring space debris, space weather, and near-Earth objects in the world. A network of worldwide entities is important to establish a global space traffic management system that protects humanity and the planet to a global coordination and where information is shared regarding threats from space. This initiative urges political will and full awareness about the serious situation generated by space debris and the long-term sustainability of human activity on outer space. It will also allow legislation in other issues of space security for the protection of humanity and the planet, including the potential risk from NEOs, space weather, the use of nuclear energy in this deep space exploration, the re-entry of ships and crew returning from missions to deep space, and other potential activities such as tourism and space mining. The international fora and trace path exist, but which government, country, or world region will take the challenge to lead this? Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Fermin. And what I want to just say here to everybody is this was a really awesome inaugural cohort of the Ascend Space Traffic Management Diverse Dozen. I hope that people from around the globe were able to enjoy all the diverse thoughts, feelings, and considerations exposed by this great 12 voices from across humanity. And I want to thank each and every one of you, Diverse Dozen, for taking that step and being the first to do this hopefully annual event. And thank you, Ascend.